2024 will be recognized as the year when the nation state adoption has actually kicked off and governments beginning to collapse in certain countries. So we've seen that in Germany. We're seeing it happen in my home country of Canada now. And we're just seeing the kind of instability that's happened from the irresponsible spending. We're seeing things break. We're seeing the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis. We're seeing the current inflation, cost of living crisis. We're witnessing loss of faith in the institutions. All of these things are systemic and also symptomatic of a core mismatch between the systems and where reality is going. The nation state itself will dissolve once governments realize that they don't have control over the money system. Individuals will have more sovereignty as they custody their own Bitcoin and be able to kind of move more seamlessly to where they are more aligned to the governments under which they choose to live. Bitcoin as the fundamental monetary basis without necessarily having the need for these kind of fiat derivatives based on top. Maybe that's 50 years down the road. Maybe it's only 10 years down the road. It's probably going to happen faster than we assume. I don't see Bitcoin as being a human-only monetary system. The programmability gives it a much longer longevity, potentially hundreds, thousands of years.
How do you look actually back? Because I think like at the end of the year, this podcast will actually come out probably already in January, like the first week of January, but still end of the year, first year of January. People like to look back at the year, like to see what are the highlights. And I really want to go with you today in a geopolitical aspect. And I think this year is a really interesting fundamental basis to that geopolitical aspect to it. What is kind of like your highlights of this year, and what is some of your highlights of Bitcoin this year?
Yeah, I think 2024 will be recognized as the year when the nation state adoption has actually kicked off in full force. I mean, the nation states haven't really started actively accumulating, but there's already the announcements, and I think that's enough to kickstart the game theory and putting that into action. So I think, of course, the Trump and RFK Jr. announcements at Bitcoin Nashville in the summer were a real big highlight. And then that followed up with the Loomis bill in the US. I think I personally was quite surprised that the US would actually be the first mover in this space. I think in hindsight, maybe I shouldn't be so surprised, but I actually thought that Bitcoin would be something where the smaller countries with, let's say, less to lose and more to gain would be the ones that would take the front seat. And to a certain extent, that has been the case with El Salvador and Bhutan. But I would have thought that the US would have the most to lose and therefore be the most resistant to adopting Bitcoin. And that might have well been the case if Trump hadn't gotten elected, actually. So I think it's great to see in some senses that the US is going down that direction now. And that's really, in some senses, accelerated the nation state adoption story in a really big way. I think that's also happening on the backdrop of, and I think what we've seen, of course, following that is more announcements from some elected officials and some campaigning to be elected in other countries like Suriname and Poland and others. So I think we are seeing that as those big sweeping political tendencies now. And then I think that's happening on the backdrop of also seeing many, let's say, center-left governments beginning to collapse in certain countries. So we've seen that in Germany. We're seeing it happen in my home country of Canada now. And we're just seeing the kind of instability that's happened from the irresponsible spending during COVID now starting to take the after effects starting to become visible and apparent, and what the irresponsible spending of governments who have access to money printers, what the result can happen in those cases.
Really interesting. Why did you move from Canada to Denmark? What was the move there? I think I interviewed someone else also that made that move. That's why it stuck out to me, because exactly Canada to Denmark.
Okay, yeah. So it wasn't directly from Canada to Denmark. In my case, it was, I had been working as an engineer in Canada for 5 years after finishing my studies. And I had always had a dream to kind of work and live internationally, and decided to kind of take the plunge when I was about 27 years old and came to Europe initially just as a sabbatical year. Came with my bicycle, traveled around on bike for a few months, and then landed in Berlin in the summer of 2012, and decided to set up shop there for about a year. And it was actually while I was in Berlin that I discovered Bitcoin for the first time. So that was around November, December of 2012 when I made my first purchase through Mt. Gox. And at that time, I was also very much influenced by watching Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert on the show they had on RT at the time. And that's where I think I initially got orange pilled. I don't think that term existed back then. But that was, that kind of, I went very much down the rabbit hole. I didn't have a full-time job or studies or anything. I really had a lot of time off. So I'd had the opportunity to kind of stay up late and just do a lot of thinking and research into the space. There's a lot fewer thinkers and podcasters and everything in the space at that time, but really thinking about what the long-term implications would be. Sadly, at that time, I didn't have enough personal conviction to put too much money into it. And in fact, I kind of went through the same path a lot of people do, where they just see the price volatility moving from $30 to $100 and try to make a quick buck by selling on the market. And in hindsight, obviously, that was a foolish path to go down. But then over the next few waves, I started getting more and more conviction. And now I would say I'm like a highly convicted person when it comes to Bitcoin. But anyhow, how I got back to Denmark, I after my time in Berlin, I did a 1-year master's program, and then got offered a job with a big consultancy out of Oslo. And then from there, got exposure to a big corporate client in Copenhagen and worked in corporate strategy with them here in Copenhagen. And then I actually did a stint in Vienna. I lived in Vienna for a few times in between Copenhagen. So I've worked there with your big oil and gas company in 2018 and 19, and then later on a crypto brokerage called Bitpanda for a year and a half a few years ago.
Oh yeah, Bitpanda is one of the biggest crypto exchanges in Europe now, right? I don't have them on the radar because I only look at Bitcoin only companies, but like honestly, they are huge. Like they is one of the rare examples of really big successful Austrian companies. Like there's like Red Bull, Swarovski, and there's some big names out there, but they're usually older. Bitpanda is a recent success story, and it's interesting that we have that with the current political landscape. One thing that you really said that you said was interesting, because back then when you got orange pilled and it got better every year, and I feel like especially 2022, 2021, it got really good. We have way more amazing educators now in the space. You have, of course, your big ones like Michael Saylor, Seifert in the Moose, Natalie Brunel, Jeff Booth, all the big ones. But you also have so many tier 2, tier 3 educators that do great content, that do so much content, so much quality and quantity of the content, where it's just way easier to fall down the rabbit hole now than it was in like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and definitely 15 years ago. And that's something that I look at and was like, oh, I see now people that came into, I don't know, June 2024, they entered the first time Bitcoin, and they already know so much. They're already so educated on Bitcoin, where I'm like, I needed so much longer for that because there has not been as good of education. And I entered in a good time, like 2020. Imagine someone entering in 2015 or 2012 or something like that. So I think that's an underrated accelerating factor for that whole Bitcoin adoption. How do you see that? Or how did you observe that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. And I think in my own story, I did kind of go cold for a period because of the Mt. Gox hack. I think that kind of shied me away from Bitcoin for a number of years. But I think I do feel like there's just much more rich options space that appeal to different types of personalities in the Bitcoin space. So it's a much more diverse landscape. And then I think the rabbit hole itself, to maintain that metaphor, it's just a bigger rabbit hole. There's more caverns to explore. And I think that's the really cool thing with Bitcoin, kind of more holistically, is that it isn't one thing. I mean, it is at its instance like a monetary technology, right? But its implications are so multidimensional, right? In the sense that it's going to, my perspective, I think it's going to change the global financial system. I think most people would agree with that. But then as a result, I think, ultimately have political implications, change the geopolitical order that we're existing in, potentially change the entire political paradigm beyond nation states. And then also, I think at a core societal implications in terms of, how we spend our time as individuals and the relationships we have with others. So I think that's, given that it can and trends. And I think that's something great about your podcast is you bring in people with all these different perspectives that explore the different caverns and nooks and crannies of Bitcoin. But it is a very rich tapestry to kind of, explore and understand. So it's really cool.
Absolutely. And I want to get back to the to the topic that I wanted to get with the geopolitical thing. And I think you are right on when you say, like, for me also El Salvador was way earlier than I thought. And USA was way more early than I thought, because El Salvador is kind of a country that you would think is primed to adopt Bitcoin. It's a struggling country. It's a country that is depending on the US dollar.
They had already given up monetary control in a sense. Yes, they had nothing to lose in some ways, right?
Absolutely, and exactly, they are primed to do that. But the USA, that's surprising for me, to be honest. And even in hindsight, to be honest, like I still don't get why they are so early. Why other countries that are struggling way more are not as aggressive? Why is Argentina not more aggressive on Bitcoin? Yes, they have this like, oh, let's have a free competition, but America seems to be like already one step ahead of that. Like they're thinking about strategic reserve currency. Yes, in the EU, we also have now one French woman that stand out and say like, propose that plan, but it's like one out of how many, 700 or something like that. It's not a lot. In Germany, yes, we have now, as you said, centered left government that has completely failed. In the whole government structure that was before like at 60% rate, they have now 30% agreement of the general population. So those things are really escalating quickly. What is your kind of like a thought around the current geopolitical landscape, and maybe then we can move towards how do you think Bitcoin will change it in the future?
Yeah, I mean, the current landscape is, I mean, I don't tend to see myself as a political analyst, so I haven't really been following too deep into any specific country's policies from a non-Bitcoin perspective, I think. But definitely, I think we're seeing, I would say this, I mean, I think what's being seen in our kind of day and age, both in terms of politics and also when it comes to the monetary system and the way people live their lives, I think we're seeing evidence that symptoms of the fact that we've sort of, the systems that we've built around ourselves have reached their limit, and we're seeing things break. Right? We're seeing the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis. We're seeing the current inflation, cost of living crisis that is pervasive across the entire developed world. We're witnessing loss of faith in the institutions. So I think all of these things are systemic and also symptomatic of a core mismatch, I think, between the systems and where reality is going to in terms of technology and the way we live our lives and so forth, and also probably a symptom of demographic change as well, to a certain degree. So I think within that context, I think then Bitcoin comes in, and I think to a large degree it's a solution. I wouldn't say it's a panacea that's necessarily going to solve everything. I think I hear a lot of people say perfect money, and I don't believe in ideals. I think it's a more perfect money. I think some flaws will be exposed over time. But overall, it will be the solution for many of the problems we're facing today. And then to kind of focus in on the US and maybe what would have drawn them to move faster than what outside observers like us might have imagined. I think at the end of the day, they have the most widespread surveillance network and intelligence agency of the world, where very few people are privy to what they are having, the discussions they're having internally. And I think there's already been, prior to Bitcoin, the rumblings of the US dollar's hegemony, how important that is to its economic primacy globally, and as a result, also its ability to kind of influence itself at a world level. So I think I'd be surprised if the best intelligence thinkers would look at Bitcoin and say, no, this is just nothing for the last 15 years. I think they might have started with that view, but I imagine that at some point something flipped and that they started actually recognizing it for what it was. And then I think there would have been a discussion about, when's the right time to act? What are the pros and cons? How do we do this? And so I do think that behind the scenes, they probably have they've done some real thinking, and there's been a strategy invoked. And And maybe not. Maybe it is just organic and just Cynthia Lummis, one senator out of Wyoming, to propose this, and Trump just happened to have a few conversations. But I think maybe the conspiracy theorist in me thinks that there's kind of real analysis and state agencies that have been following and thinking and planning and strategizing with regards to Bitcoin. I would have hoped it would be the other way, because I think that would have resulted in a more, I think, revolutionary change. And I think what we're seeing is, as US's first mover, probably will maintain its hegemony going into the future as a result. So I think even though there will be pretty massive political changes in the order, it does appear now that, I think the US will maintain hegemony, but hopefully in a way that's more, righteous and less militaristic than they have in the past.
Interesting. Do you think what implication does that on the US dollar itself has? Do you think that will have an effect of even prolonging and bettering the US dollar long term, because they can back it with Bitcoin and they can have the early mover advantage while being the world dominant force?
Yeah, I think it's going to be both that and not that. I think it's going to, in my mind, it's going to be the medium term. It'll be backing the US dollar with Bitcoin or Bitcoin-based derivatives of some sort. But I do think that that's just going to be an intermediate phase, because I do think the longer-term view, and I think this is consistent with what guys like Samson Mow are saying, I think the nation state itself will, in some sense, dissolve. I think once governments realize that, they don't have control over the money system, I think they will, first of all, have to contract in terms of what they can and can't do, and kind of spend within their means and really focus on what's really important. I think it's also going to be matched with the fact that individuals will have more sovereignty as they custody their own Bitcoin, and be able to kind of move more seamlessly to where they are more aligned to the governments that they that under which they choose to live. And then I think ultimately, the powers of these establishments will ultimately be diminished and then reformed in some way, I think, right? In a way that is adaptable to Bitcoin as the fundamental monetary basis, without necessarily having the need for these kind of fiat derivatives based on top. But how long it takes to get there, again, maybe that's 50 years down the road. Maybe it's only 10 years down the road. It's hard to say, right?
10 years would be, it's interesting. Do you think that can happen that quick? Or for me, it's always really hard to imagine that happening, because I've grown up with that political system. I'm like, that's so huge, that's so big, and it's so anchored in our perspective. And I see now how long it takes for people to understand Bitcoin and to accept small changes, accept just a little Bitcoin allocation in their portfolios. 10 years, 15 years, it seems really, how should I say it? Really aggressive, even really fast. Do you think there's a chance that it takes maybe 50 years or even longer than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be 100 years out too, right? But I think in general, we tend to underestimate. I think that's the thing about the human psychology in general. I think there's some instances where we overestimate how fast something can happen, how quickly. But I think it tends to be the other way around, where we do think about these linear perspectives when many of these adoption curves happen in these S curves that we talk about. And I mean, maybe if you think about the French Revolution, talking to French people in the 1770s about would there ever be something beyond the monarchy, at that time, probably people say maybe at some point 100 years from now or 200 years from now. And then in, the 1780s, there's a whole revolution, a whole new system that emerges. Of course, in that context, a lot of violence and conflict for decades afterwards, which might also be the case in this political revolution as well. But no, I think I don't know for certain when it would happen, but I do think if we're to choose an average point, it's probably going to happen faster than we assume, and not slower.
Interesting. So 10, 15 years. So that's also the point where you don't...
10 to 50 years, I'd say. 10 to 50, somewhere between
10 to 50. Oh, I thought 10 to 15. Oh, okay. Yeah, 10 to 50. in that's then the point where Bitcoin is the dominant world reserve asset. There is no longer fiat currencies, because if there would be a fiat currency, there would also be then nation states. It's hard to imagine, like, how different are our lives at that point, whenever this is.
Really good question. I don't know if I've gone to that point of thinking about that down at the individual level in these cases, but I do think that I think it's hard to envisage. I'd like to do more thinking and talking with political theorists in this space, but I do get the sense that we are. Yuval Harari in his book Homo Deus, he talks about how the political decision making it's too difficult for any one human or any group of humans to kind of take in all the input variables and come up with the optimal decision to kind of respond. And I think we're going to see this emergence with AI to help enable decision making in the first instance, and then maybe in the next instance, like defer decision making to AI. So I do think that will probably be some big step towards the future, in a sense that we are actually, in some ways, as humans, like relegated, if you will, away from the decision making, because we're actually imperfect in that, more imperfect than the AIs that we can create. But I do think overall life will be better for people. I think we will be able to, on average, escape wage slavery and theft from corrupt centralized systems, and be able to spend our time in ways that are more meaningful, whatever that might mean for different individuals.
That's interesting. When we come a little bit closer to where we are now, I feel like there's still a lot of career risk going on. Like right now, there's still, like, if you're a politician that speaks out for Bitcoin, in the US, probably now it's better and better with Trump pushing it and making it possible. We have in the German parliament one lady that says that she's extremely for Bitcoin. I know, because I spoke with her, that there are many more members of the German parliament that are for Bitcoin but don't want to speak out because they are afraid to get kicked out of the party. The same is true for probably CFOs around the world that are in the power position to make that move, but are like, do I want to improve the company balance sheet, or do I want to keep my job? And that career risk is still there. What do you think has to happen in order for that career risk to dissolve in the short and medium term?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I watched the interview you had with the German member of the Bundestag as well. I didn't catch the whole thing, but I did catch parts of it, and I did recognize the fact that, to that point when she mentioned that there's a lot of people who are, like, let's say, in the closet Bitcoiner proponents, but not willing to come out. But no, I think if we look at the analogy with the US, right, I think that's a situation that if we could take to an individual level as well, right, where they're in the position with the most to lose. And then I think if you look at CF, but also potentially the most to gain. And if you look at CFOs, they're in positions of power. They have high-paying careers, high reputations. So again, most to lose, but also, they're steering the largest companies in the world with the biggest balance sheets. So also potentially the most to gain. And I just think that it's a bit surprising that there still is such a negative stigma. I think I think part of it is that there's just widespread negative myths and stigmas portrayed on Bitcoin. So there needs to be work done to demythify, debunk the myths. I work right now in the sustainability area, and the biggest argumentation that people would have, when they first hear Bitcoin, they're going to say, "Oh, that's bad for the environment. It's boiling the oceans. It's a waste of energy and generating tons of emissions." Right. So I think, and it's not entirely untrue. The Bitcoin network does consume a lot of energy, and it does generate emissions as a result presently, but it's not necessarily true in the sense of what the alternatives are, what's the trajectory of Bitcoin, what else is the positive impacts that it has on the world are not really being communicated. So I think there needs to be accurate research done into the aspects of the both positive and negative impacts, and then conveyed in an honest way to the public, right? because right now it's very much opinion based, let's say. So I think bringing a bit of science to the matters will hopefully help sway minds. And then I think there's just going to be just human resistance to change as well psychologically. I think people are inherently a bit scared of new things, and that's always going to be something that new things will have to overcome. And then in instances where like political systems are vulnerable as a result of this, and incumbent, not just power structures, but in wealth structures like the incumbent financial system, there's always going to be people, defending against it as well, right? So being able to combat that. But I think what we're seeing now, at least in those, is not necessarily this kind of like Bitcoin is destroying in the first instance the incumbent systems, but rather it's merging with it in some ways. So it's not an antagonistic fight, but actually some sort of symbiosis, even though it's going to, I think, like ultimately become the dominant thing in that kind of amalgamation, if you will, over the longer term. So I think we're seeing this thing transcend from an adversarial fight into something more synergistic. So I think that's maybe part of it as well.
I mean, it's healthy that there's a transition period. It's like I really like to use the example of a Titanic or a big boat sinking. You need the lifeboat to be ready and the other boats to be ready to save the people that are on the boat in order for it to sink in a slow, steady, organic fashion, so that you don't have a lot of deaths in that case, or financial deaths it would be then. So I think it's healthy to go slow, to go organically, and that's how Bitcoin should grow. And I think it won't grow like that. I think it will be way faster than we think. I think it will be extremely quick to adopt and extremely fast to rise to power. But healthier would be slow and steady over many, many years to come. So we have a nice transition period. If you're on drugs, or if you're on if you're sick also, you want to get rid of that thing slowly, and don't do too much. Like, there are many analogies we can try to paint there, but in general, I think it can be dangerous, not for Bitcoin, if that thing is going too fast in maybe like civil wars, civil unrests, things like that. If Bitcoin goes next year to 10 million, there will be a lot of unrest in people saying like, oh, that's unfair that those Bitcoiners have that wealth. If it goes next year to 350K, nobody will complain. Like, it's an investment. Like, it's logical for people. How do you see that? And especially if you have like a timeline that is like 10 to 50, but like if we get to the 10 years, we need really a quick transition there. Can it also be dangerous and resulting in civil unrest?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I tend to think about it when looking at kind of the geopolitical order and three potential scenarios. And they don't really think too much about the time dimension in them. But I think when I think about, of course, the speed of the change would also probably be a variable that would lead to more unrest. But when I'm thinking about it more, at least the geopolitical level, about power structure changes. So on scenario one is kind of the one I would call the coordinated, harmonious approach, where nation states decide, okay, we're all going to go together. We're going to allocate Bitcoin proportionately to our current, gold reserves and wealth reserves more generally, so that we maintain the current balance of power as it is today. Now, the chance of that happening, I think, is very, very unlikely, right? There's always going to be people that want to get more, move faster, get more wealth and power at the expense of others. And then I think also that if you look at the geopolitical setup today, there's this bipolarism or multipolarism emerging between, the BRICS bloc and then the kind of NATO bloc and stuff, right? So to see these blocks not be adversarial in terms of Bitcoin accumulation, I think would be naive, right? But that is a scenario, let's say, if there really is this kind of global coordination. And then the second one would be one where there is upheaval, but in a way that is, let's say, still largely peaceful. So here there is a race for Bitcoin. There's a race between countries or blocks of countries, potentially also, talking about, corporations and miners and how they play into the system and to what extent they'll cooperate or be targets of nation states. But ultimately, despite there being changes in geopolitical power as a result of Bitcoin accumulation over the next period of time, any sort of unrest that emerges is contained. So I think that's another scenario that we can see, right? And then the last scenario is the one where not only is there significant change in the structure, but also conflict and violence. And I would say that this is probably the most likely scenario, in fact, simply because I think history, being any sort of benchmark, would tell you that when there is massive political structural changes, changes in the geopolitical order, that tends to result in conflicts from the incumbents that are losing power to lash out and try to maintain their authority through violence as a last resort. So in some ways, I think it's kind of good that the countries of the world that are the big military powers are also the ones that appear to be the first movers, if it's true that we hear in the rumors about Russia and China, and also the US moving forward. So in some ways, it might be good if they're the ones that move fast and first, because they can, if they can maintain their power level in the future, there's less likely chance they're going to lash out violently. But I do think ultimately there will be some degree of, it's more likely that there will be some degree of conflict as we go through this transition than not.
I partnered up with Coin Vigilante. This is the most beautiful Bitcoin timepiece that I ever saw created by anyone. Look at that beauty. I love it so much. Coin Vigilante made a perfect Bitcoin watch. That's the perfect, subtle, elegant way to go out there and show that you are a Bitcoiner. And that watch brand is Bitcoin only. And Coin Vigilante just dropped a completely new and amazing Genesis edition of their watch collections. You have the date of the first ever mined Bitcoin block in there, and of course also the block height and which epoch we are currently in. I love the level of detail they put in this masterpiece, and make sure to check out those amazing Coin Vigilante timepieces down in the descriptions. I love those watches so much. If you watch or listen to my podcast on a regular basis, I guess you already bought some Bitcoin. And now the most important step is to keep the Bitcoin. Keep them secure in a hardware wallet. My personal recommendation for hardware wallet is the BitBox. It's super secure. It's simple to set up. It's also a perfect gift for a friend who has still their Bitcoin on an exchange. And you can get a 5% discount with the code Robin at the checkout. Visit bitbox.swiss/Robin to get your BitBox. And the next step is to really level up your sovereignty as an individual. You have to have the most secure self-custody setup. You have to secure your own devices. You have to protect your privacy. You have to set up an inheritance plan. And depending on where you live, you even want to have a plan B, a citizenship where you can move in case something goes really wrong. And through all those steps, the Bitcoin way is guiding you through step by step. And if you visit thebitcoinway.com/partners/Robin, you even get a 30-minute free call to find out how you can level up your sovereignty. That's a point that I never thought about, that it's actually good if China, Russia, and America has early exposure to Bitcoin, so they're not lashing out with their military power to like El Salvador or other small countries that adopted it earlier, because already now the USA has so many more Bitcoin than El Salvador. And they will have so many more than El Salvador if they actually start buying. And they have also the whole industry is there, and the mining is there and stuff like that. So like they have the power there. And I never thought about that point. It's an interesting thing.
if I can keep on going in this kind of vein, I guess, bringing it back to the modern day, countries that I know well are the ones I've lived in, right? So Canada and Denmark, Austria as well. I don't have as much opinion on them at this stage though. But if I look at those two, those are actually ones that I am somewhat concerned for, and kind of in different reasons for it. So in Canada, I don't know if you've been following the news recently in Canada, but the government's about to collapse. The finance minister just resigned earlier this week. It's a dead duck prime minister sitting right now. He has the lowest approval rating in of his entire career, but also of any prime minister who's ever been in sitting right now. I think it's less than 20%. And his party is starting to mutiny and so forth, because most of them are calling for him to resign. Point being, Canada has zero Bitcoin. They're in an economic malaise. They've been financially mismanaging their accounts for worse than the rest of the world for the last decade. And they are just struggling to kind of find their footing now to actually just have a functioning government. So there's a risk that they just are asleep at the wheel and miss the entire Bitcoin boat over the next few years, right? If the rest of the world starts moving and they're just asleep at the wheel. I think the one saving grace is there's quite a few miners in Canada. There's a lot of energy there. So there's a lot of cheap energy, stranded energy. So I think there's a lot of mining which will happen there, which can only be good for the country. But people have been saying, I don't know if you've heard this recently, but Trump has been making repeated jokes about how he thinks Canada should become the 51st state. And part of me believes that that's potentially not even a joke, right? I think it could be a situation where Canada is partly from its own doing, partly from the US exerting economic warfare on it, but could actually, ultimately put in a position where it needs to be annexed. And I think it wouldn't be the first time that Trump has made tweets that were initially seen as jokes that ultimately became reality. So I think that's one, somewhat dystopian or utopian, depending on how you see it, future. There's a liberation or a subjugation of the Canadian people by the US, but I think that could be something that results from as part of the whole Bitcoin nation state game theory. Shifting gears to Denmark, I love living here. It's a super well-run country. Everything works super well. High taxes, but there's a high degree of trust in the institutions. There's much less corruption. The money tends to get spent well towards social services, and it's a good place to live for so many of those reasons. But I think it's for those reasons that also they're the type of country that will probably be one of the last to react towards Bitcoin, because they have no. There's a lot more skepticism I find with Danish people. It's simply because they're like, why would we change the system? Why would we impose something that would threaten a centralized socialist system that, from our perspective, works very well, right? So I think there's also a situation where, and they can afford to do it also because they have just such great businesses. They have some of the world's largest companies that came out of Denmark. Europe's largest company by market cap, Novo Nordisk, is here. There's Lego, there's Maersk, there's many others. So there are a wealthy, industrious, small country that can afford to pay for social services without taking on a huge amount of debt. So I think it's be a shame that they have everything kind of going super well, and then they might still be the last ones then, because of that, to move towards Bitcoin and embrace it. And might find themselves actually more towards the bottom of the heap when the dust settles over time.
It's also interesting how Canada, we have the same thing in Austria, we have the same thing in Germany. Those center-left governments are collapsing more and more. How connected is that to Bitcoin? Or maybe how connected is that to the thing that we described earlier with that political or the geopolitical movement towards no nation state and all that?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's necessarily related directly to Bitcoin at this stage. I don't think Bitcoin has prompted it at this stage, the collapses, but I do think the fact that the existing paradigm that is kind of a combination of both the political structure of elected officials through party representation, in combination with a monetarist economic theory. I think that combination has kind of reached its limit and is realizing that it's not satisfying the needs in a context of changing demographics, right? Both in terms of, like I think the primary one being that these developed countries have decreasing native populations, and the need for economic growth then relies on either immigration or thinking about a new paradigm, right? So I think that combination of factors is what we're starting to see play out in terms of these ultimate collapses in these systems. Now, I don't know if it's necessarily the fact that they are by virtue center left, but I do think there is with these parties even less fiscal responsibility than maybe the center right or right parties. But I think every party, this is irrespective of the party in power, I think the system itself, what that enables governments to extract value from their citizens through money printing, through currency devaluation, is the core issue, right? And I don't think it matters. I think to draw an analogy, right? I think back in the monarchy days in the 18th century, you might say, okay, we have a good king this decade, right? And when he dies, we have a bad king. His son was a bad king, and then we have a good king, right? And it's not the fact that it's a good or bad king. Yes, that can sway it a little bit, but it's the fact that you have a monarchy system with a king imposing their own individual decrees. That's the issue, right? So taking that to the current system, it's a bit more the system than the parties themselves in a way.
Interesting. Yeah, it's also like even if there are individual politicians that really want to do great changes, there's a party system, there's the democracy system, where there's maybe in the whole system something wrong that needs a more fundamental basis of restructuring, then less than there's something wrong with the individual politicians, even though, of course, they have some level of influence on that, but like the system itself is rigged and the incentives are not good enough. So you want to say something to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's primarily an incentive issue more so, and an access to certain powers issue, and a conflict of interest, and than it is more so the first word you said, right? Where it's, I can't remember this, but yeah, I see it as an incentives issue rather than nefarious intentions. We'll put it that way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You brought in AI before, and it's super interesting what role in that transition AI can play and how this will impact humanity, as we also see Bitcoin as one of the big things that's going on, but AI is also a really big thing, and I think they are complementing each other.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting topic. I might bring a different view to this than others, because I haven't done too much thinking about the here and now, and I think there is something happening in terms of the compute becoming the common currency, if you will, that both Bitcoin and AI are reliant on, right, and becoming something of an oil for the futures in some ways. But I think the view I'm going to take is something that's like really far out and deep out. But like I have this kind of philosophical perspective about the nature of humanity as such. And I think to put it in a bit of a nutshell, I don't really see life as having a defined, point in at which life began. I think this life force is sort of more of a continuum. So in some ways, I think we like to say, at some point we say there's these cells, these chemical processes that have RNA or DNA, and these things are alive, but the things they came from, the molecules that predestined them, the lower level of complexity was not alive, right? I think if you zoom out, it's all kind of one continuum, and even there's some degree of life force within the totally inanimate rocks and hydrogen molecules and water, right, from which we came, right? And then to kind of play that forward, we're not an endpoint, humanity. We are a step in that continuum, but we're at the forefront right now. And we are kind of birthing at this stage, the next stage of life as we know it, right? And it will be, so it's not something adversarial to us. It is our offspring in a way, right? In that kind of like life force continuum dimension, right? So, with that perspective in mind, I think there's also maybe one other dimension like that I kind of bring through is if you were to kind of zoom out on, human population on the globe over the last 50,000 years, it would look pretty much like a straight line horizontal and then a straight line vertical. And already we're seeing indications that a lot of people are forecasting population decline, not longer population growth. I think our population growth rate began decreasing about 20 years ago. And that's only going to continue to accelerate. And so what this could look like, if you were to zoom forward another 50,000 years and then look at the whole 100,000 years of humanity, it might just look like a spike. And during that spike is where all this action has happened in terms of, us developing all this technological, industrial revolution technology, internet, communications, AI, ultimately, that then spawns out during that spike. And then humanity, maybe there's a small few of us just kind of custodians or janitors for all the infrastructure here on Earth, while AI is out at basically at the forefront at that level, evolving and changing it in realms that we can't really fully comprehend. So to then tie that a little bit back to Bitcoin, right? And I've only just started doing my thinking in this space, but I don't necessarily see Bitcoin as necessarily being a human-only monetary system. There might be the need for the AIs themselves to still have at their core this need to exchange value amongst themselves. There's still a finite amount of energy that they're drawing upon, and still decisions that have to be made, whether to do this or that, whether to calculate this or that. And so in order to make those decisions, there might still need to be an exchange of some sort of value between them for this AI system, this kind of hive mind, whatever it might look like, to ultimately decide whatever it is doing, right? And so Bitcoin might still persist even if humanity itself doesn't, in some way within this AI complex, as a medium of exchange, if you will.
Interesting. It also brings up the kind of the question: is Bitcoin maybe even beyond human beings the final money, the last form of kind of money that we use, because we can modify it if we need changes towards it. We don't need to change the money. We can modify the existing system now, which is hard with something else. Like gold is not modifiable in that sense.
Yeah, I think coming back to my view of I see perfection as an ideal and not an endpoint, not something that exists in reality. So I think the programmability gives it a much longer longevity, potentially hundreds, thousands of years, right? But I could imagine that even Bitcoin will at some point be outlived, and be supplanted with something different at that stage. But I mean, that's so far in the future, and I'll definitely not be here, and humanity might no longer be here. But I don't see it. I don't think there's ever such thing as forever. I think everything's constantly in shift, if you will.
There are some that say that if you're now born and you live to like 70 or 80, you have a good chance of living forever, because humanity is progressing in medicine, where every year you live, you add more years to live than you reduce it. It's kind of, I like the idea that humans die. I like that, like, old generation gets out and new generations come on. I think that's like a beautiful thing of progress also. But if that's possible, and if humans live forever and we kind of get to, I mean, they probably can still die, but it's also interesting what then happens, because then you all of a sudden get really cautious with everything, because now we have we only live once. We know we will die anyways at 70, 80, 90, 100 years old, something like that. But if you have the potential to live another million years, you have a lot of time left in your life, and you don't have to take it fast, and you can go slow. Will probably make us really cautious as human beings. But that was not the thought that I wanted to go to.
No, I think it's an interesting one. I think from an individual perspective, I'd love to live much, much longer, right? And I just feel like there's so much to see and do and think about and talk about and explore that it feels a bit shortchanged to only have 90 or 100 years. So I think if I had the option to say, yeah, you could live much, much longer, as long as you wanted, I think I would take it. I do agree with you in the sense that I think there's something good about finiteness. I think it's something that forces us to stay creative and not to ossify. I think if we could just live forever, I don't think we would necessarily procreate as much, and I think we would, kind of stagnate probably in some ways. But I don't know if I had one more thought about that, but there was something else I had, but I lost it. I think that it's necessary for human kind of creativity and progress that we have some degree of time span to work within.
Absolutely, and people are. It's so funny because I put sometimes titles and thumbnails around longer time horizons when we talk about what will Bitcoin look like in 2050, and there are a lot of comments coming my way and saying like, what do I care about how Bitcoin looks in 2050? I don't even know if I'm around. Like that. I don't care what will be life like in 2050 because then I will be like 80 years old or whatever. Or maybe I will already be dead because 2050 is still 25 and a little bit of years away from us, but it's not that far. It's like I'm 26, so it's like one Robin lifespan to 2050 if you want to measure it like that. But one thing that I really want to get also in the podcast, and you posted that topic also, when we compare Bitcoin now, the real estate, and the other things that Bitcoin might demonetize or is already demonetizing, how do you look at the full potential of Bitcoin? And if we take a look at Bitcoin as money, the full potential is always like human capabilities. But like, what do you look at like? How much can Bitcoin get from real estate, from all the other markets, and then from the currencies and stuff like that?
Yeah, I guess it is an endpoint where again when we get there, I don't know exactly, right? But I do think whatever these inferior forms of money that are currently acting as monies have in terms of the value that is utility, and then the value that is money being a store of value. I think all of that store of value amount will be sucked into Bitcoin, and they will reduce down to their utility values. So then it would be interesting. I've seen some people try to do this analysis, right? I think with gold, it's relatively easy because it's fairly easy to understand what the utility value of gold is with some simple, stock to flow and DCF models, assuming you know how much gold is in all the vaults. That's another kind of question mark. But with things like real estate, I think it's a bit more difficult, and there's so many different markets and all that, right? But I think as an ideal endpoint, we will see that happen, and I think again that's going to be good for humanity, right? We won't have to store gold, and I think it'll be an interesting, funny situation, right? Because we're gonna have like this huge amount of gold for thousands of years worth of utility value just that comes on the market, right? But then for houses, it's going to be great because I think this cost of living crisis, housing crisis, if people want to buy houses, most people will be able to buy them. I think at that point in time, a lot of people realize they probably don't want to buy houses because they realize what a pain in the ass they are. But I think it's gonna be good because a lot of things that have become monetized probably shouldn't have become monetized. So I think it's going to be good. And then, as we all kind of know, then everybody participates in the productivity gains of the whole globe, right? Just simply by holding the currency that they earn in, right? So I think we're going to see that people are feeling that they're in a more fair system and being able to not necessarily get into debt slavery if they don't want to, and not feel forced into it. So and not feel like they're on this treadmill for always keeping up with inflation and so forth.
Fiat makes you desperate. That's for sure. And one thing that you just mentioned with gold, I imagine if gold really gets demonetized heavily by Bitcoin in a rapid fashion, we have all that gold sitting around that people really want to sell, and this will put a lot of pressure on the gold price measured in Bitcoin on there, which might be the result of we stop digging for gold to a certain extent, or like heavily limit that, because now we have all the
There's
gold
almost
in
no
the
economic incentives for it, right? I mean, we will have thousands of years of inventory on hold, right? People will probably be trying to give it away, I think, at a certain point, right? It's
Absolutely, yeah. You
yeah.
can just like give it away, and then you can use it for smartphones and stuff like that, where gold is actually as an industrial use case, and it already has, and it will be great to use that gold for. It's also an interesting environmental argument. If we don't use gold anymore for money, it's demonetized. We can use the gold to put it in our smartphones, and I can stop digging for it, and that's the big pollution thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I haven't looked at this number. Something that just kind of came to me, but from what I understand, gold is even a better conductor than copper, or aluminum or silver, right? So potentially, it's so cheap that we could actually, use it as a better conductor than other things that we're currently using, and maybe that will drive productivity and efficiencies in our electrical grids and so forth. So it could also have those kind of ramifications on our energy system and positive environmental implications thereafter as well.
Absolutely, and the positive environmental impacts of Bitcoin is amazing to look at. Like I really love to speak with people in Bitcoin energy or in Bitcoin mining segments, where I'm like, oh wow, like you can do a lot with reusing heat and lowering the electricity bill for everyone, while using power that you would have used anyways and heating a home. Like those are really interesting concepts, where we like, maybe we have a Bitcoin miner in every household because it's just the most efficient way to get the cheapest electricity for everyone. I really look forward to what human engineering can do with Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, and can bring the world forward without even the money part of it. The money part is just like a really great benefit towards that. But what Bitcoin mining can do for electricity costs and the environment, it will be really, really great. And that shift from narrative from Bitcoin mining is bad for the environment and it can just consume energy to we actually need it. That's a huge one. And I think we get there.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think in hindsight, when we look back on this, it's going to be hilarious to see how all of these things that were seen as negatives ultimately were the exact opposite in hindsight, right? I think Bitcoin's a scam or a Ponzi scheme. No, it's the current system that it's replacing that's actually that. Same thing with this environmental impact narrative. So I think it's an interesting thing with Bitcoin, and I think it's also been probably similar with again technological revolutions that happened in the past, right? There's all these myths that are actually more focused on the existing system rather than the technology that's replacing it.
I have one interesting thing that might be interesting to share here with everyone, that is shining a light maybe what's happening right now with Bitcoin and what could happen also long term with Bitcoin. Let's see if I can pull it off. Yes. You can see my screen here, and that's the anti-electricity propaganda. And there's a lot of that. Like we more recently, because those things are like old, but there's more recently with the internet, we had the same thing, where a lot of FUD came along the internet. We were like, oh, internet is just a FUD and stuff like that. Electric cars, cars in general, electricity, all those big innovations had in the beginning a huge blowback. And then all of a sudden it came anyways. And now we cannot live without electricity. Now we cannot live without internet. And at some point we cannot think about living without Bitcoin. It'd be like, what? Your country didn't adopt Bitcoin? I mean, there are parts of the world that don't have electricity, that don't have internet. And we will look at those countries the same way we will look at those countries that then don't have Bitcoin. And that's kind of how I see the future devolving with Bitcoin.
I think that's totally consistent, right? And I think in the entities, whether it's countries or companies or people that want to resist, I mean, they can only resist for so long until at a certain point they have to, when the whole rest of society moves forward, they would have to isolate themselves to be able to really, entrench like North Korea or something to really shelter yourself from Bitcoin because of the network effects, right? Yeah, I'm getting a bit tired, so I'm losing my train of thought here. But no, I was going to say the resistance, and I think also, ultimately resistance is futile, so to speak, in some ways, because it's inevitable, right? When there's I think this is just technological waves and shifts and paradigms. You can't force people not to use something that's better than the alternative, right?
People naturally will. People naturally credit it, go towards those technology versus even if you forbid it, even if you ban it, like people will go towards that technology and really want to have them. Like look at North Korea, like it's super obvious that you really want to have innovation, you really want to have those things in your life. Yeah. Really cool. I have one question, as you know, that I asked each and every one of my guests, and this is the question of what can we learn from you besides Bitcoin?
Interesting question. I spent so much of my time in the last little while, like just spending all my free time thinking about Bitcoin and like watching content and stuff. But no, I think something I do kind of for fun that I know a little bit about is traveling by bicycle. So I've done kind of long distance touring. Independently on a bike across different parts of North America. I went across the US back when I finished my undergraduate degree. I've done long tours here in Europe. And it's just a fantastic way to travel. And I have lots of tips and tricks and highly encourage people if they're ever considering a novel and low cost way to travel and see the world a bit slower than through a train or a car or a plane is to get on a bike and just go and see the world that way.
Now that's amazing, by the way. That's really a good way to travel. It's interesting. It's also a Denmark way to travel, I feel like.
Yeah. I think part of what drew me into Denmark is the bike culture. I have like 5 bikes here or something, so it's a different bike for different purposes. So.
Oh, really? 5 different ones? Like how many purposes are there?
Yeah, well, 2 of them are actually the exact same purpose. I just my commuting bikes. I had one in Vienna and one in Copenhagen, and then when I moved back to Copenhagen, I took my one from Vienna. So, but the other ones, there's a carbon bike, there's an aluminum bike, there's the touring bike, mountain bike. So yeah, there's different purposes.
Really cool. That's great. I have currently 0 bikes.
Okay.
But I liked biking. When I was back in Munich, I had an electric bike actually, and this was really fun because it was just the fastest way to get to the office. My office was with the public transport 15, 16, 17 minutes away. With car, mostly even more because there was traffic. It was like in the middle of the city and parking spaces were really limited. And the bike was the only thing that got me there in like 12 minutes, especially if it was all flat. And after electric bike, you just like really race through the city in a rapid time. And you can take all those small shortcuts. You get a really direct way of it, no stops. And I loved it. Like every day, even in winters, like I had like 1 or 2 weeks where I stopped doing that, like in January, I think it was. But almost completely through the winter, I was traveling with the bike in Germany. So that was a great experience.
Yeah, there's something liberating about, traveling out in the, fresh air in the morning, even if it's cold, and also not having, feeling like you're stuck in traffic, waiting for people. If the metro shuts down, there's lots of people and crowded, you feel a bit like contained, but there's something, very, liberating and free about being on a bike, I find. I do have one electric bike that I got for, I have a 2-year-old son, and we have these, Copenhagen is kind of famous for these Christiania bikes with the box in the front that you can kind of put children or groceries or whatever, right? But that's an electric, a battery-powered electric bike, and I'm still kind of getting used to the whole electric bike thing. It's kind of a new thing for me, but it's fun.
Yeah, my main thought was I don't want to sweat in the office.
Yes. That's polite of you. That's respectful for your colleagues.
I was like, I want to go there and don't sweat. So electric bike is perfect for that. It's just like, and it was, how was it called? I forgot the name, but it was a popular brand even. Oh shit, like electric bike. Maybe I can find it. Popular. Let's see how it comes up. No. It has like an app and everything, and was really nice to drive. To be honest, I liked it a lot. But something with an. Let me see. Maybe I can find it quickly. And no, I don't find it. No way out of finding it. I will send it to you later if I find it. Cool. But it was a really good one. And it had an app, and if you can, there was like an illegal app that you can buy for like €8, and then it was driving instead of 25 kilometers per hour, it was driving 35, and that was amazing.
Okay.
It was not
they took off the governor and let it go like full potential.
Just like letting it throw. It did drain the battery a lot, but I didn't care for that because I could charge it in the office and at home, and it probably like got me through like 2-3 days, anyways. And it was so much faster. It was just really nice. Like in the piking lanes, I was always the fastest one.
Love it.
But yeah, really cool. Thank you so much. We still have the end routine of the podcast, where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is. And the question for you is, how can a regular pleb play a significant role in orange pilling the world?
Good question. I guess I'm one of those everyday plebs. So I guess from my own experience, I haven't changed the world yet, I guess. But I think not being afraid to, not just absorb content, but think about your own ideas, write them down, and then communicate them with others and sharpen them. I think it's about just entering, sincere dialogues with other people who want to, discuss these issues, whether they agree with you or not, and get your voice heard one way or another, whether it's just with your neighbor or your friends or to a broader audience. I think that's the change that manifests, even if it's not the same change that a super influential person has. I think it still is important, and I think that's how the orange pilling is spreading, right? It's happening not only through the big communicators like the Nat Brunels and the Michael Saylors, but it's also happening on a individual one-to-one basis with individuals like us. So super important.
Truly grassroots movement, and I like that message a lot. Really cool, Ted. Before I let you go, where can people find you, ask you questions, and reach out to you?
So I've just started getting active on X. So my handle is Ruxpin84 on X. So I will. I guess I'll give you the handle. You can put it to the comments below.
I will put it in the description and put it there, and people can directly find it. So thank you so much, Ted, for being on the show. Also, thank you so much for everyone that's watching and listening for joining us today. As always, I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Bye bye.